So in this video, we want to introduce you to the Shaped by God's Together process, which is underway now in the Diocese of Leicester. So some of you may have seen the video that Bishop Guli and I did a few weeks ago, issuing a call to prayer to the diocese as we begin the process of trying to listen to what God is saying to us and get a sense of how the diocese will look in the years to come. So I'm really pleased that today I'm joined again by Bishop Guli, but also by Stuart Burns, our Director of Mission and Ministry, who are going to just explain a little bit more for us about the Shaped by God Together process and why we're doing it and where we've got to with it as well. So Stuart, I'm going to start with you because you're helping to facilitate this whole process. So do you want to just tell us a little bit more about why we're doing this and how we're doing it as well?
It's a really interesting process to be involved in. And it's actually at its heart is really quite simple. As we are, as a diocese, making decisions about our future, we are aiming to be faithful to the past, where we've come from, to be faithful to the present, where we are, and to be faithful to the future of where God is calling us to. And the Shaped by God Together process and the story gathering process that we've been involved in is about being faithful to the present in many ways. It's about learning from each other, it's about listening to each other, and it's about engaging with each other. And the best way to do that is through telling stories. It's the way we do it all the time. We do it when we meet in cafes, we do it when we go for walks with family and friends. We tell each other stories and then we make sense of them. So the story gathering process, the Shaped by God Together process, is about listening to each other as individuals and as churches, so that ultimately we can be in a position where we can make the best possible decisions with the best possible information that we have as we go forward. We've gathered loads of stories, got about 550 stories, some from online, some from interviews, some from paper gathering, but a whole wonderful kind of data mine of stories for us to pay attention to.
And there was a lovely sense, even this last week, when we had the first of our study days with clergy and lay leaders, of weaving together our stories with God's story and actually looking at how those different stories, the multiple stories, if you like, all weave together with God's story. So, Guli, I wonder if you could just share a little bit. You've started the process of listening to some of these stories. Obviously, we've not been through all 550 of them yet. But as you started to hear some of these stories, what have been your early impressions? What are you picking up from it all?
Yes, well, as you say, there are many more stories that I haven't seen than I have. I've probably managed to engage with about 20, 25 of them, something like that. We've had some opportunities in various different groups to look at clusters of the stories together and do a little bit of sense making of our own. And I've been very struck by how important it is to give each of the individual stories their own kind of individual integrity without interrogating them too much and just wanting to listen something of the voice behind it. But also that as soon as you put 5, 10, 15 stories alongside one another, it is possible to spot some of the patterns and the themes and the threads that come out, whilst also being surprised by the individuality of some and what they have to say individually. So, I mean, the themes have been very broad, but I think on the whole, I would say that the stories suggest that there's been a huge amount of creativity during this strange period that we've lived through in trying to make sure that people stay connected and have opportunities for worship and supporting one another in discipleship and on journeys of faith and so on, but that ultimately nothing quite replaces the opportunity for physical gathering and the importance of us retaining that as something that we want to continue to reflect on and concentrate on in the times to come, however difficult it may be. I would also say I think that 550 stories is fantastic, but there's many voices that we haven't heard. Hundreds and over 1,000 thousands, probably more, that we haven't heard. And I think there is a sense in which probably those who are invested enough to engage with this process are on the whole giving us a really positive weave and a positive overlook of the situation and their experience. And I think it is important that we continue to get as real a picture as we can. And so I just want to encourage people to continue sharing their stories and being as honest as they need to. That's really what we're after, a real and an honest picture.
Yeah, I'd absolutely want to emphasize that as well, in terms of needing to hear the honest stories, even if those have been difficult, and stories of pain indeed as well. So, Stuart, you've seen slightly more of the stories probably, and indeed you've had to go through some of the data as well about who's been sharing those stories and so on. What struck you from your first look at all of that?
I think overall, the thing that struck me is that there's no such thing as an average story. Every story is different. Every story is uniquely invested in the person that tells the story. And so one of the things that we're trying to do as we read the stories and sift them is to honor the person that's told us the story. One of the reasons that we do that is because individual stories are so precious, and you do feel like you're holding a little bit of a gold mine, because people have let you into some of the struggles and some of the joys of the lockdown experiences and their faith experience that they've had. We've had them from across the diocese. It's a fairly good representation, and we've had them from across ages. I think sometimes you look at the kind of stories that we've got and who we've got them from, and you think actually they do represent us as a diocese. We're a kind of generally an older group of people. So we have at times, you can say, okay, we need to go back and look for some other stories. So part of the sense-making piece is to look at who hasn't told us stories and go and find them and have a conversation with them. So we're doing some intentional work with head teachers in the coming few months. They've got enough on their plate than telling us stories at the moment as they're opening up schools, but trying to find out what's going on in your area and in your neck of the woods. Similarly, we've had a good measure of stories from across cities. But just trying to work out whether they've only come from particular areas of our city, and where have they come from maybe our estates or from our parishes that have different ways of sharing information. So you look at the stories, but you also look at the gaps, and you try and go back and say what's missing. And the other thing you do with the stories, which this process does really well, is that it does something called sense making, and it just says, actually, I'm going to look at your story and I'm going to show your story back to you and ask you, is that right? And we'll put it in partnership with another story. And so we'll get the rural stories together, and we'll go to some of the rural churches and go, this is what we've seen, but is that right? Do you recognize yourself within that? And you kind of tell the stories twice in that sense, and you get layers of insights that come out of them. You go, okay, that's what that means. That's where your connection is. That's where your riches is. You really talk about, for example, in the rural church, some of the stories about the difficulty of having a building that's been closed and keeping community together, when the building is where you gather for community and also gather for worship, and picking some of the riches in that is really important. So yeah, we go back, we sense make, and what we don't do, really importantly, is we don't judge the stories, because every story is an individual story. It's not there to be judged. It's there to help us in our learning, so that when we make decisions that we make in the future, we do that with the best knowledge that we possibly can.
And just continuing on that theme a little bit, Guli, we're very keen, obviously, through all of this, that it should help us in terms of our care for one another within the diocese. And so the theme of well-being is something that we want to be running right the way through this whole process. Do you want to just say a little bit more about that and your reflections on how we go about that?
Yes, thank you. I mean, ever since I first arrived in the diocese, I've been really committed to ongoing reflection and exploring around how we can attend as well as we possibly can to the area of well-being, both for our clergy and for our lay leaders, and indeed for the flourishing of all of God's people. And the recent weeks and months have been particularly testing and challenging, and for a lot of people it's been an incredibly difficult time. I wish I could say that we had answers for kind of solving the conundrum of our well-being, but of course we don't. We are going to look very carefully, and indeed have already started looking carefully at the stories and what they're telling us. There's going to be lots of different streams of work going on in the weeks and months and possibly years to come. We're going to have to see changes in all kinds of areas of diocesan life. And I suppose, want to say to people that I'm absolutely committed to keeping the kind of overarching theme of well-being across all of these areas, and constantly asking ourselves, how are our decisions impacting people's lives? Ultimately, I kind of want to promote a culture of well-being in which we each take responsibility for our own well-being and know the boundaries that we need to put into place and the ways in which we need to operate, but also a culture in which we look out for one another and notice when other people aren't feeling well or don't seem to be themselves, and that we're proactive about trying to get alongside people. So in a sense, the best I can promise, I think, is that we will go on talking about well-being, we'll go on exploring it. It's an open-ended topic. I think it was Margaret Weekly, the author, who said something along the lines of, you move in the direction of the questions that you ask. We'll keep asking questions, we'll keep being interested in people's lives, and together, I hope, we can move towards a culture where we can both take our responsibility and the kind of element of sacrifice that is part of ministry, whilst also being sensible in terms of how we look after ourselves and one another.
Well, thank you both for a really helpful explanation around this process. And just finally, a comment from me in terms of the next steps and where we go with this. We're really keen to hold this space for at least these next few months, so that we can continue to gather stories, continue to try and do the sense making that Stuart referred to earlier, and through all of that, discern what God is saying to us at this time. Inevitably, as we get towards the new year, we're going to have to start to move a little bit more into the whole area of clear ideas and options around the future for the diocese. So we have got a number of work streams that are underway already, just beginning to look at questions around buildings and finance and shapes of ministry and so on. All of that then will be presented to the diocese through the spring. So we're planning a whole series of different gatherings through the spring, where we will want to come and talk with you more about the options for the future, leading up to a diocesan synod meeting in May of next year, when we hope that under God we can reach a consensus about the right way forward for the diocese. Undergirding all of that, of course, we want to ensure that prayer is right at the heart of all that we are doing. So my thanks to all of you who have been praying already, and my request that you go on praying for this whole process, not just for us in terms of our leadership responsibilities in the diocese, but indeed for all those who are involved in our churches in any way at all, and all those we work with in our local communities. So my thanks to you all once again for all you continue to do. And we're going to try and continue sharing these updates through these videos, not quite as regularly as I was doing in the early part of the lockdown when I was doing weekly videos, but nevertheless, we'll make sure they're regular and we're keeping you up to date. Thank you.